distinguished guests, speakers, and participants. A very good morning, afternoon, and evening to all of you. On behalf of the General Council for Islamic Banks and Financial Institutions, I have the honor and pleasure of welcoming all of you today to this webinar on Islamic Finance and ESG, Bridges to Sustainability Integration. Ladies and gentlemen, the focus on sustainability integration within the financial sector is growing, and it is growing really fast, especially with the rising environmental and social economic challenges faced by global societies. The COVID-19 pandemic, the climate change, and social issues such as poverty are curbing the growth of the world economies. And this alarming situation has pushed policymakers and regulators to make the financial system more responsible towards the society and the environment through the integration of sustainable practices. Environmental, social, and governance, in short, ESG, are the three important factors considered by companies, including financial institutions, to assess the integration of sustainable practices within their core business activities. And measuring the known financial performance is not the only important reason for integrating ESG standards. It is actually their impact on the results, returns, and also long-term risk of the investment portfolios of financial institutions that actually makes ESG more significant. We come together in this webinar today with a diverse panel of speakers to dive into a discussion on the alignment of ESG factors and Islamic principles, as well as the factors driving the global financial sector towards ESG and sustainability integration. Ladies and gentlemen, before we start, we'd like to make a couple of announcements. If you have any questions throughout the webinar, please do not hesitate to write them in the Q&A section that appears below, and we will try our best to answer all these questions. The webinar will be recorded and posted on social media platforms in the coming days, so please follow us on our social media accounts. We will also appreciate your kind feedback on the organization of the webinar today by filling out the evaluation form that will be sent to you by email after the end of today's webinar. And now, without further ado, I have the pleasure to call upon Dr. Abdulillah Bilatik, Secretary General of CIBAFI, to deliver his welcoming remarks. Dr. Bilatik, the cloud is yours, please.
Thank you, Mohammed. Distinguished guests, excellencies, dear colleagues and friends, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you, wherever you are. It is a great pleasure to be here, and I would like to welcome you to this CIBAFI webinar on ESG integration for Islamic finance. This week is a very important week for all of us. As you know, the United Nations gathering and world leaders are gathering in the United Nations annual meeting, which is being held right now in New York. And some of the key areas talking about is, apart from geopolitical issues and problems that we all know, there is one pressing problem, which is the climate change action, which is everybody's responsibility to have to contribute in reducing its impact on all of us, on humanity. Before I say a few words about the day, let me first thank all the speakers and thank all the participants to this webinars and to the speakers for making the time to attend with us today and share with us their experience. So as I said, today is part of the global action for the SDGs, which is this week with hundreds of thousands of activities being held worldwide to show world leaders the importance of sustainability, sustainable development goals, and in particular climate action that is needed. As we have seen, the recent weeks and months, extreme weather events have made it very, very difficult for everywhere, from Europe to Southeast Asia, with floodings happening and drought happening in other parts. So all these disturbances make the responsibility on all of us to ensure we live in a more sustainable world. Of course, there are challenges, and the financial sector has a responsibility to facilitate this process of sustainability and sustainable development goals. One of the tools for this is ESG integration, or what we call environmental, social, and governance framework that has to be integrated as part of the financial sector, because the financing need for sustainability are tremendous, are very, very important. And to address these challenges, contribution from everyone is key. It's no more, again, a luxury to be doing this, is no more just because of risks. So it's the responsibility of all of us as humans to contribute in our ways in reducing the impacts and the challenges related to climate change and to reducing poverty and so on. And for the financial sector, of course, this sustainability integration is no more, again, it's only, in one hand, it's, of course, it's a challenge, but it's also an opportunity. It is an opportunity, but it also brings some potential risks if not addressed on time. And we can just see what has been happening for the last few years on this area. And then we can see where the financial sector in leasing and the regulatory environment is going. Like around 1-2 years ago, there were the establishment of the central bank network for greening the financial sector. And this, of course, recoups all the central banks. They have now over 100 central banks part of this network, and trying to see how to make the financial sector greener, meaning how to have better contribution of the financial sector to climate change action with regulatory requirements, with perhaps some other tools of reviewing the risk profiles of the portfolios of the banks. And this relates to all banking sector, all financial sector. As you also know, the Basel Committee on Banking Supervision has been thinking and consulting on how they should address the climate change risk for the financial sector. And there was some exposure draft discussions where CIBAFI, of course, has contributed. So there is a thinking on this, and this will certainly have some future implications for the financial sector. On the accounting side, the IFRS Foundation has established the International Sustainability Standard Boards, which then addresses, of course, the standards on sustainability. And there were 2 exposure drafts that were issued early this year, and they are being finalized, and where, of course, CIBAFI has also gave comments of the Islamic banks on that area. There was also recently, pretty recently, just a few weeks ago, maybe 2 to 3 weeks, calls from the IOSCO and others at the regulatory bodies for the IFAC, the International Federation of Accountants, or the IAASB, the International Assurance and Auditing Standards was, the body that issues standards for auditing. So there were calls from the IOSCO for having more work related to auditing of sustainability, in addition to all the standards that are being issued. So we see, in addition to this, on the local level, many regulatory bodies, central banks, they have issued guidance and to their financial institutions to see how they can address, first, starting with the issues related to the climate change and transitions that are needed, and second, sustainability in general. So we see that for the coming years, this will not become only like as a marketing tool or as an opportunity. It also will be becoming no more luxury, will be a must-do for everybody. So that's why it is very important for all of us in the financial sector to be ready for this change and this transition. And this is why CIBAFI, from a few years ago already, 4 or 5 years or even more, we started these talks with our member banks and other regulatory bodies to see how we can help the financial sector to be more sustainable. In addition to the fact that this, for the Islamic banks, is a core mandate being on the objectives of Sharia. So there is very close linkages and correlation between the two. So CIBAFI started with some research and awareness even from 2015 on this problem. And we have issued a number of publications, including with the United Nations and with others, or within our surveys. And we have established 2 years ago, 2 years and a half ago, a sustainability working group that is dedicated to these issues of sustainability, where we were very happy to issue a sustainability guide few months ago, and we are working very closely on some other projects, including carbon footprint projects that will be with the, measurement methodology for the carbon footprints of the portfolios of the Islamic banks, which will be ready in the next few months. In addition, working on some capacity building and certifications for the sustainability, for how to integrate sustainability into Islamic finance and Islamic banking principles. And in addition, last but not least of our initiatives is the CIBAFI Award for 2023 next year, that has been decided already from last year, that the topic for next year award will be on sustainability and ESG integration within Islamic banks. So this shows the importance of this topic really to us. Now there are challenges of how to do it, how to integrate, and this is why we are working closely with our stakeholders and friends on a number of topics related to this, how to make this happen in practice. And this webinar today is part of this awareness process. So we hope that it will shed light on a number of areas that can help the financial sector and Islamic banks how to integrate sustainability and ESG within their operations. With this, thank you very much, and thanks again all the speakers and the participants for attending with us. And please follow our activities, and any way you can contribute with us, you are most welcome to join us. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Belatik. Ladies and gentlemen, we would like to welcome now His Excellency Mr. Khalid Al Makwad, Resident Coordinator, United Nations Bahrain, to deliver his keynote speech. Your Excellency, please, the cloud is yours.
Thank you very much, Program Director. So I will be speaking on behalf of the United Nations in Bahrain with the following statement. So Abdul Latif Belatik, Secretary General of CIBAFI, Excellencies, distinguished speakers and participants, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi. First of all, let me thank the General Council for Islamic Banks and Financial Institutions, CIBAFI, for the kind invitation to speak at this webinar. It is a pleasure to share the United Nations views in Bahrain about Islamic finance and its role in financing the 23rd Agenda for Sustainable Development adopted by the UN member states in 2015. Acknowledging the need of adequate financing for the Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, the United Nations member states also adopted the Addis Ababa Action Agenda as the blueprint for the global partnership to finance sustainable development. It envisages concrete measures for member states to mobilize and streamline all possible financing flows to realize the 2030 Agenda aspirations. Before the COVID-19 pandemic, the financial gap to deliver the SDGs by 2030 in developing countries was estimated to $2.5 trillion. And based on these estimates, the gap would increase by 70% post-pandemic to reach $4.2 trillion. Many countries face challenges to meeting targets of the 2030 Agenda due to a greater need for funding, restricted ability to collect and allocate resources, in addition to difficulties attracting private investments. As a response to growing global needs, the international community has put emphasis on emerging and innovative financial approaches, which combine the intention to generate positive, measurable social and environmental impact alongside the financial return. The green bonds remain the largest source of impact bonds, while sustainability-linked bonds demonstrated the fastest growth, expanding by 10 times year on year. However, despite its significant growth in recent years, globally impact bonds still represent less than 2% of the total bond market, and there is a considerable room for growth for these types of bonds to be used to meet the financing gap needed to respond to climate change and support the SDGs. Ladies and gentlemen, the main ethical and moral principles of Islamic finance, such as complementarity and unitarity, suggest that all stakeholders should be treated equally, and their interests must be considered in a fair and just manner. This is extended with justice as a must outcome in any business activity or financial transaction. These principles are strongly interlinked with both the SDGs in addition to environmental, social, and governance criteria known as ESG. Islamic capital markets have demonstrated unprecedented success in generating finance for corporate and public sectors. Sukuk have been a particularly important Islamic capital market instrument in development finance, supporting sectors such as education, health, and infrastructures. In recent years, green Sukuk initiatives have emerged in responding to environmental and climate-related emergencies. It is appreciated that Islamic finance institutions identify the SDGs as an area of priority both for multilateral and country-level perspectives. I'm happy to see that today's workshop reconfirms this commitment. Thanks to CIBAFI for this excellent initiative. The UN organizations have been engaging with Islamic finance through a broad range of activities, including development financing, technical assistance, in addition to research and development. There are examples from a range of UN agencies, such as, for example, United Nations Development Programme, UNDP, the UN Environment Programme, UNEP, the UN Industrial Development Organization, UNIDO, the Food and Agriculture Organization, FAO, and UN Women, who are guided by the UN Secretary General Strategy for Financing launched in 2018. The Secretary General Strategy sets out ways in which the United Nations can support the fundamental shift in international, regional, and national financial systems that is needed to align economic policies and financial frameworks with the 2030 Agenda. It builds on the Addis Ababa Action Agenda and draws the work of the Interagency Task Force on Financing for Development, which includes the United Nations, the World Bank Group, and the International Monetary Fund, which produces annual reports on financing for sustainable development and organizes the ECOSOC Financing for Development Forum annually in New York. To conclude, 2023 will be a critical year, as we will conclude the 8-year cycle since the agreement of the 2030 Agenda and the Addis Ababa Action Agenda. In September 2023, the General Assembly will convene the Global SDG Summit, which will be the second since the adoption of the 2030 Agenda. It will be also a critical year for the Kingdom of Bahrain, as the country will present its secondary voluntary national review to the UN High-Level Political Forum in July 2023. I seize this opportunity to commend Bahrain's commitment towards the SDGs. Today's event represents a good opportunity to address how Islamic finance can be better aligned with sustainability principles to leverage its huge potential to support SDGs implementation. The United Nations remains available to contribute to supporting Bahrain in this important process. I wish to all successful deliberations, and I thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency. And now we will start with the panel discussion of this webinar, which I have the pleasure to moderate. We have with us a panel of 5 distinguished speakers to discuss the key challenges in adopting ESG frameworks and what are the standards, regulations, and the strategies that can be adopted or can be followed successful for adoption, reporting, and other related areas. But firstly, a brief introduction of the speakers. We have with us Mr. Bashar Al-Lantour. He is Global Head of Islamic Finance at Fitch Ratings UAE. We have with us Dr. Vivi Yulasawati. She is a Senior Advisor to the Minister, National Development Planning for Social Affairs and Poverty Reduction in Indonesia. Dr. Dalal Asuli, she is Assistant Professor and Islamic Finance Program Coordinator at Hamad bin Khalifa University, Qatar. Ms. Sina Bassam, she is ESG and Sustainable Finance Advisor based in Egypt. And lastly, we have Mr. Shafi Al-Manai. He's Director of Human Resources and ESG at GFH Financial Group. Thank you all for joining us and welcome to the session. Mr. Shafi, if I can start with you first. I understand that many from our audience, they have the background or knowledge of ESG, but for the benefit of those who don't, please give us an overview of ESG, how its definition is like, criteria and benefits, and also if you can share your opinion on the comparison of ESG and Islamic finance principles. How do you see it? Are they complementary concepts? And if yes, then what are the common grounds in your opinion? Please, the cloud is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Mohammed. I'd like to first thank CIBAFI for this very important, essential topic that is being trended and should always be focused on, especially with the overchanging things that affects the corporate and individual level. When it's come to the broad definition, I'm sure everyone is aware of, but in my humble opinion, from what I see is the awareness that the organizations has impact on all levels, has contributed a lot to where we are today. If we give a brief history of just ESG, it started way back, but probably it sparked more with the civil movements back in the 50s and 60s towards the 80s, where also United Nations thankfully have also been very effective in that area, especially toward the 90s, and where countries committed and signed treaties. So if you go in the back, it's always been there. It's all about how we see it and how we emphasize on the changing year after year. And it's important whenever we link ESG to corporate, it is becoming exponentially important in terms of how organizations, corporates are affecting the communities and societies. ESG in a broad definition, which are environment, social, and governance, tackles one of the most important aspects of the evolution of humanity, the evolution of business continuation, the evolution of better human living and increasing the standard of living. And this is exactly what it matches, or let's say in parallel with the Sharia law, which is the Maqasid of Sharia, which one of the guys that I've seen CIBAFI, which is a great impact and a very great contribution by CIBAFI. So when we link those two, we have a great definition understanding to all people, from corporate levels, individuals, societies, and goes down even to the house or the family. So if we have this kind of impact on all broads, it gives us good vibe and good, we become ambitious to put more. However, becoming more optimistic is not enough. The years ahead is becoming more challenging. And as you see in the past years, if we compare the 50s, the 60s, and the past century, compared to how exponentially and how accelerating it is becoming, especially when it comes to environment, it is becoming very alerting. And the way that we should perceive this topic should become more serious, especially in the corporate level and the countries and the government levels, which thankfully it is becoming a very great impact nowadays. So in general, when we compare the definitions, the awareness, the way that we are today now, it may not be enough given the extreme changes and acceleration into the environment and the overchanging, I'd say, fact in the world. So if we put more efforts on all in terms of individuals, and even it goes to individuals, up to the government level and the regulators, I think we'll be at least in par with what we at least aspire in the next 5-10 years. But the work it takes a lot of effort, I would think, in the next 5-10 years as a challenge.
Right. Thank you, Mr. Shafi. And also the other half of the question, which was when we compare ESG and Islamic finance principles. So how do you see that do you look at them as a complementary concept? They have common grounds when we compare these two?
Absolutely, absolutely. If we go back to the Sharia, when it comes to the Sharia, the main aspect or the main aspiration of the Sharia, it is mainly to create fairness, prosperity, safety to the individuals and the society, provides fairness in terms of transactions, markets. So the spark of the Sharia that has started at the beginning and the rise of Islam has already built the ESG fundamentals, if you put it this way, because ESG today is more of a derivative of what Sharia is aspiring. And the way that we see ESG, if we take an example for the social, providing equal opportunities, providing a fairness in transactions, providing, let's say, transparency in all the Islamic transactions, this all becomes, when it comes to the financial performance, is it attributing a lot to the growth of the organization. So ESG, I would say, in my humble opinion, is within the financial institution is a derivative of what Sharia is promising and aspiring. So whenever we embrace these kind of things, it's very easy for Islamic institutions to implement ESG other than conventional, not being biased here in a way, but the way that you compare both guidelines and policies, you would notice that the establishment in the Islamic institutions, especially where giving, for example, diverse products that provides more fairness and Sharia compliance products, where conventional probably are more of a revenue pure generated decisions, whereby both, of course, are revenue generated oriented. But when it comes to Sharia as a base, it would give more, in line with the ESG principles that we always aspire to have. So in conclusion, there is a bit of advantage for Islamic institutions to implement, to ongoing develop, and always have the ESG as part of the Sharia compliance structure of the organization.
Interesting. Thank you, Mr. Shafi, for sharing with us your views on the ESG and also the comparison between ESG and Islamic finance principles. We will definitely talk about it more in our discussion with Dr. Dalal on when we will be discussing about the CIBAFI Sustainability Guide. But before that, I want to bring in Mr. Bashar into the discussion. Mr. Bashar, in the last few years, we have seen there is a growing awareness among investors on ESG issues. And that is one of the reasons why financial institutions are developing ESG-linked products to answer their calls. So please give us some insights on the ESG-related issues and trends in general, and also specifically to the GCC region, and how well the Islamic finance industry is doing in ESG integration. Please.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you very much for having me. And I think the question that you've asked has multi-dimensions. Let me start with the simple dimension, i.e. where does the OIC in general, which is the 57 countries, and the GCC fall when it comes to actual climate change physical exposure? Because I think let's understand that is this something that's good to have, or it's really something that is really having a big impact? And we've done a study last year, and in that study we've looked at more than 110 countries, around 114. And the ranking of that 114, if you look at extreme temperature and drought, 5 of the 6 GCC countries are in the top 10. Let me give you a flavor and numbers. So if I look at the extreme temperature out of these 114 countries, UAE is actually number 1 in terms of exposure. Saudi Arabia is number 2, Qatar number 3, Kuwait number 6, Oman number 7, and Bahrain is number 17. They are really there. You're really exposed to that. And I think living in the region and being here, I think all of us know what extreme temperature and drought is, but it's a reality that needs to be dealt with. And I think the realization of that is not only in the GCC, because if you look at other countries, if you go, maybe the GCC is higher ranking when it comes to extreme temperature and drought, but if you look at floods and storms, you start seeing countries like Bangladesh and Indonesia and Pakistan coming higher on that risk, and GCC coming lower. So whether you look at the GCC or other countries, I think exposure to extreme temperature and drought, floods and storm is a serious issue. It's not a good to have, it's there. So with that, I think at the back of our minds, I think it's worth seeing what's happening on the ground. And if we look at many of the visions and strategies and agendas of many of the countries in the OIC, and the GCC, almost all of them actually, you will have a sustainability vision. So whether you're looking at Saudi Arabia Vision 2030, or UAE Green Agenda 2030, or Malaysia Plan, Indonesia Vision 2045, Qatar, and the list goes on. Now it's part of that. That when I say now, it's a recent trend. Yes, many of the OIC countries are signatories to Paris 2015 agreement, but the actual realization and this being higher on the agenda of many countries is something that we've saw just in the past few years. Now, this is a discussion in general. So, okay, fine, this is the situation. How does Islamic finance fits in the equation? I think it's very important to state first that there is definitely commonalities between Islamic finance and ESG and sustainability, but they're not identical, definitely. You really need to go the extra mile to achieve the targets and the appeal for ESG and sustainable investors, or ESG and sustainable industry globally. And I think that's a very important thing, because many of the countries in Europe and maybe investors in the US and other investors, they're already having these strategies in their guidelines, budgets, restrictions, etc., etc., etc. Here in the region, if you're talking about the investor, issuer, I think it's still evolving. So it's still in an early stage. What is really already evolved in many of the countries, in the GCC specifically, is Islamic finance. And Islamic finance, I like to think of it, is a form of ethical finance or responsible finance that's been there for more than 40 years. So it's built on that side of the thing, but it's not identical. So Islamic finance is not automatically addressing environment. It's not automatically addressing social issues, although it has its aspects. It's not automatically having better governance. I think these commonalities need to be worked on. But you also need to be mindful of that even if you have all of these, that does not make a transaction Islamic finance. You have to have a structure and a user proceed that is complying with Sharia. So you need to think of it in 3 dimensions. The first dimension is impact. The second dimension is negative filtering. And the third dimension is structuring. The first 2 are common with conventional. So negative filtering, Islamic finance. So when I'm sitting in any of the presentation of ESG, whether in Luxembourg, Frankfurt, US, or whatever, you'll find a slide there with tobacco being crossed, alcohol being crossed, gambling being crossed, pornography being crossed. And when my turn comes, I just asked that gentleman who was presenting, he's not an Islamic finance, he's an intern. Can you go back to that slide? This is already ticked in Islamic finance. So you're automatically not having any of these there. But that doesn't mean it has the other side of the thing, i.e., is it addressing the environmental issues and what have you? And I think this is where Islamic finance fits. If we are looking at numbers, and I think Dr. Abdullah mentioned that, a recent study shows that there is an actual funding gap between 700 billion to 1 trillion to fund these ambitions, strategies, and milestones in the countries. And we think that many of these is going to be actually being done on top of Islamic finance. That's not a theory, it's an actual fact. And the way that I would like to state that fact is, let me take country specific. So if we look at hard currency sukuk that has been issued in the GCC or in other OIC countries. So the ESG related issuance in Bahrain, for example, 100 of that came in a sukuk format. In Saudi Arabia, 90% of that came in a sukuk format. Indonesia, around 58%. Other countries, you will have a varying percentage. But in the GCC in general, 75% of hard currency ESG related issuances came in a sukuk format. So actually, the path that we saw in the past years, if you are going to an ESG issuance, sustainable, transitional, green, etc., it's usually built on sukuk, not on conventional bond. So it's a reality. And here we're talking about the sukuk market. So that is a step that is very important because you're starting with a point that you are already seeing that this funding gap, if we're talking about it, it's being actually significantly financed in the GCC by sukuk. The trend that we saw of growth since 2018 till even the pandemic years, and even in this challenging environment, it's actually a growth trajectory. So ESG related sukuk has been on the growth trajectory. We actually rate around 80% of hard currency ESG linked sukuk, ESG related sukuk globally. So out of that, you can see that that trend has been growing even in our rates portfolio, which is a significant part of the actual outstanding there. So whether you look at that dimension, whether you look at this dimension, you'll find that. I can go through the highlight of development of regulations in member countries and how they're doing that. There are developments, but they're recent. And what is more important, we are really watching and saying, are these going to be translated into actual action that is transforming the ground? And is it going to be including the private sector? And is it going to be having them as part of that equation or not? So I think this is an interesting development. We've seen many countries putting strategies, actually COP26 and COP27 and more. Some of them are actually hosted by OIC member countries or Middle Eastern countries. So you can visually see that this is definitely becoming higher on the agenda. Now, how is that going to be translated on the ground? I think it's another issue that you need to look at. Maybe to move to banks, and I think this is an important point. In the way that we have the ESG credit relevant scores, we differentiate actually the ESG scores of Islamic Bank compared to conventional into 2 areas, which is the governance structure. And there, if you see conventional peers, i.e. conventional banks, they usually will have a relevant score of 3, where Islamic banks will have a higher score of 4. And that is because of the additional layer of the Sharia governance that you have there. And the other one is the social side of it. And if you look at the conventional peer in the region, you will see that usually these they score 2, where Islamic banks score 3. That has a lot of elements, whether or not being able to charge delinquency interest, whether that interest is going to charity, whether you have a zakat, whether you have a other type of structuring. So it's already visible. So for us, even when we are assigning ESG relevant scores as part of our credit ratings, this is considered, and we differentiate Islamic banks on that dimension. And I think this is an important step. What is really, I think, interesting to note is that the trend that we are seeing on 3 dimensions worth noting and monitoring. First, the governments, and I think that's the starting point, because they will put the frameworks, the incentives, if any, the way forward, and that will create opportunities. Because if you have a funding gap, with many of these countries having diversification of funding policies, you'll start seeing a realization of a true partnership with the private sector, and that will create opportunity, whether on the issuer side or even a development on the investor side when it comes to these opportunities. So that's one. 2, are we going to be seeing more fundamental changes in the way that banks, financial institutions, GREs, and what have you, of having actual targets that they need to achieve in their portfolios? I think there is a discussion. What the industry started to have a realization a few years back that, okay, we have a unique proposition, we have a responsible proposition. Can we really benefit from the trend that is global now and build on it? And how our offering appealing to more than Islamic sensitive investors and issuers? And this is key. So is the Islamic finance industry, I think it's on a crossroad. Are they going to start and saying, okay, we are not only for the Sharia sensitive customers, issuers, bankers? Are they going to be appealing to the wider group of international investors, saying, on top of that, we have sustainability and ESG related issues? And I think this trend is an important trend to watch.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bashar, for sharing with us this very interesting insights on ESG-related issues and trends also. My next question is to Dr. Dalal, and that will be built on the discussion that we just now have with Mr. Bashar, that Islamic finance industry, we have to go an extra mile in order to integrate sustainability into our Islamic financial institutions. So we know that recently CIBAFI, we have issued a sustainability guide, and Dr. Dalal, you were also part of a project. So please take us through why do we need to have such guiding document at first place, and how it can be helpful for Islamic financial institutions and in order to integrate sustainability and ESG practices into their, from the top level to from the governance strategy, from operations, their products and services, and so on. Please.
Thank you, Dr. Muhammad, and pleasure being today with the distinguished speakers to talk about a timely topic, which is sustainability integration by Islamic financial institutions. I think the previous speakers mentioned the timely importance of this topic now that there is a global mobilization for climate change mitigation and for achieving sustainability globally. And that means that there are 2 trends that will shape, or that currently shaping how financial institutions, including Islamic banks, are conducting financial intermediation. So we've seen that on demand side, there is more and more pressure from customers and investors for products and investments and instruments that integrate social and environmental objectives. So in 2020, for example, about $2.3 trillion have been invested for impact. And that trend is growing further after, the issues that we have witnessed during the pandemic. I think first presentation, he highlighted some of these issues. And of course, in the OIC region globally, broadly, we see issues that have to do with health, with education, with food security, sustainable infrastructure, etc. So that means that Islamic banks have a responsibility to respond to this growing need by revisiting the products and services they offer. And then on the other hand, we see similar mobilization from the regulator side. Until now, yes, ESG existed before, and most of the initiatives were voluntary. So you had a number of guidelines that, were based on a voluntary principle, in the sense that you have a group of investors or institutions coming together and developing a set of principles that they integrate in their business activities and that demonstrate their commitment to sustainability and impact. Now the trend is that these principles would be enforced through regulations, and we see growing mobilization from the regulator side with more ESG dedicated regulations and sustainable finance roadmaps that will further enforce or enhance the participation of the financial sector to sustainability, to sustainable objectives. And we see that through the EU, the ASEAN, and a number of other countries globally. So that means that integrating sustainability is no longer a nice to have or a choice by banks, including Islamic banks, but it's a must to contribute to this global mobilization for sustainability and impact. So where to start from? So this is the question that would be important from the side of Islamic banks, and we have seen some separate initiatives either focusing on the reporting side or the investment side or the product development side. And as I think Bashar mentioned earlier, we see a lot of innovation specifically in the sukuk market, which is very interesting because the sukuk market represents less than 20% of the Islamic financial industry, whereas the Islamic banking segment represents more than 80%. So that's where most of the innovations should come from. Now, the guide that CIBAFI issued a few months ago, which is one of the major actually developments for the Islamic financial industry, it provides that framework that supports banks in responding to all of these challenges in a more holistic way. So that suggests an approach that is integrated in terms of how to integrate sustainability, and that starts from the strategy of the institutions to the operational side. And the way the guide is structured, it's based on 5 key principles, which starts with corporate and Sharia governance, simply because Islamic banks have already a Sharia governance model that looks into the compliance of their business activities. So how can we integrate sustainability in that sustainability governance in that already existing model? So adding to that a dedicated organ in that governance structure that looks after sustainability is critical to support the various committees of institutions, including the Sharia Compliance Committee, to integrate or to assess basically the sustainability impact of any transactions that the bank would have. And then moving to principle 2, which looks into a wider approach of sustainability integration, and that is through a variety of areas. That starts, as I mentioned, from the bank's vision and mission and strategy, and to the internal resource management, and then the bank standard and operating procedures, and then capacity enhancement and business activities. And that is very important when talking about impact, because if it's not integrated in the strategy of the institution, then it's very difficult to achieve the expected impact that we mentioned earlier. So how, practically speaking, banks can do that is more actually thinking process behind how vision and missions are being developed. So how, for example, a bank can establish a vision that drives sustainability within the bank. And then how that vision can be actually declined into a set of strategic SMART objectives that support the achievement of these goals. And how can these objectives be then translated into operational strategies for addressing sustainability issues? And after that, how can the bank develop a set of measurable key performance indicators and targets to improve the performance of sustainability targets in order to achieve the vision? And finally, and this is to meet actually the transparency requirements and to support investors and customers in their investment decisions, how can the bank monitor and assess the impact of sustainability integration? And then, so moving to the third principle, which supports actually the first and second principle, which is environmental and social sustainability risk management, we have also witnessed increasing integration of climate risks, for example, if we talk about the environmental side, but also there are a set of other social and governance risks that needs to be taken into consideration as well when designing environmental and social risk management system or a framework for banks to monitor continuously these risks and decide on their materiality and their impact on the institution's reputation, but also profitability. And then moving to the fourth principle that focuses on monitoring, reporting, and communication. And this is very strategic because we have witnessed in the past few years the development of a number of initiatives that provide frameworks or scorecards or templates that support actually institutions in reporting on their sustainability. And this is very important because, again, as I mentioned, to capture this growing investor base of impact investors, including Islamic investors, is very important for institutions to be transparent on how they integrate sustainability. And that is, and reporting just on the type of initiatives they have broadly is no longer enough today, but really on how, with a clear set of KPIs, and we talk now about impact reporting with very specific metrics that show the commitment to institutions to sustainability. And finally, through coordination and collaboration, which actually supports, and this is also one of the key sustainable development focus areas, and one of the reasons why we see this global mobilization for sustainable development and for climate change through various international institutions, working groups, think tanks, is really to leverage on local, regional, and international partnerships to accelerate the integration of sustainability objectives in banks' business activities. And that supports, of course, their national visions. I'm talking specifically in the jurisdictions where they operate, but also in addressing the global challenges. So if we look at broadly what the guide offers to Islamic banks is really an integrated approach, incorporating the principles and demonstrating their commitment to sustainability. And that gives them guidance throughout 5 strategic areas that I mentioned, meaning how they conduct their internal assessment of the sustainability focus areas they need to focus on, which also responds to their national commitments for sustainability and then for climate change mitigation. And number 2, how they can align their institution's vision, mission, and strategy to these objectives. And number 3, how can they operationally integrate these objectives? And number 4, how can they also contribute to internal and external awareness with regards to sustainability? So this is targeting their various stakeholders. So beyond their shareholders is also looking at various stakeholders such as the suppliers, customers, and the wider public. And then finally, how can they monitor and report on sustainability with clear measurements and then to achieve the strategic objectives that we mentioned earlier. So with this, I think it provides the kind of tool for Islamic banks, especially those who haven't had any prior initiative targeting specifically sustainability integration, to integrate sustainability, but it also supports those institutions that have initiated some actions. Either we've seen that some institutions have integrated some form of sustainability, either through ESG objectives integration in their financing decisions. I think Bashar mentioned earlier some of the instruments like Green Sukuk, sustainability linked Sukuk, or ESG linked Sukuk in general. Or we've seen in the region also some institutions offering some green banking products targeting specific, industries or areas. However, we haven't seen an integrated approach that responds to the global challenges in a structured way. So that is why the guide has been developed to achieve this purpose.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Dalal, for taking us through the CIBAFI Sustainability Guide. And for the audience, if anyone interested to download and read the full report, I'm talking about CIBAFI Sustainability Guide, you can go to our website and you can easily download from there. Now here, if we can focus on the S component of the ESG, which is the social, which is also emphasized in our CIBAFI Sustainability Guide. And also recently we have seen there is a growing debate on the social component of ESG, that some they argue that there is a gap and financial institutions, they are not doing enough on the social factors, which it comes to financing, investment, or reporting and disclosure. So Dr. Vivi, I want to bring you into the discussion. You have a vast experience in developing social projects and programs in Indonesia. So please share your opinion with us, how important we see that this S component is, and how Islamic financial institutions can play an important role in this regard, please.
Thank you so much, Dr. Muhammad. It's been a pleasure to be invited in this precious event. Speaking of the S component, actually, this is super important because it's about the people. People has always been a focus, actually, for the global development agenda. If you remember that since 1990, we had already an agenda on the Millennium Development Goals, the MDGs, that focus on the human development. At the time, we are just have 8 goals, all about the socials, yeah. But when the MDGs ended in 2015, we face more complicated challenges, actually, globally. Not only about the increasing inequality, but we have to face the fact that we also facing challenges in the climate change, as well as in the good governance. That's why the MDGs cannot be stopped, and all of us agree to continue or commit, or the countries commit to continue the agenda toward more holistic, how balancing the S component with equitable aspect also on the economic or the prosperity, and also on the issues on the planet, yeah, the environment. So speaking of that, the SDGs actually provide a framework of collaborations as well as an approach on the impact. The previous speaker talks about the impact. And since we are now in a decade of actions toward the Agenda 2030, I think we have to build an urgency, particularly after the COVID, that only 8 years left to achieve all the targets and indicators on time. So the decade of actions is actually starting by UN Secretary General, who asked all the countries and of course including businesses to provide all the concrete actions, not only in localizing the SDGs, but also in the global actions, yeah, how to secure a greater leadership, more resources, and of course smarter solutions, because the sources is varied across the globe, and of course the solutions cannot be seen in only one or single bullet, but we need a lot of bullets to, and also smarter, because the problems particularly in relate to the people conditions. So for the context of Indonesia, we mainstream the targets and also of course the indicators to about 241 indicators into our national development agenda, midterm national development plan, 5 years plan, and the alignment of the SDGs goals and indicators transform annually through the government work plan as well as the budget. So now we work on the redesign economic transformation after the COVID or post-COVID. And we aware that actually we cannot back to the business as usual. We are now move forward for the green economy. I think the rationale previous speakers already mentioned, but the S component still have a lot of challenges in this regard. When we are talking about the green economy in the context of developing countries like Indonesia, we still to face a gap how to bringing green transition on time. So we should think of how to develop the technology, how to also bringing all the people for the green job transitions, and of course talking about financing. Inclusivity of the vulnerable women, children is not about only providing equitable access for the basic services like on the S components of the SDGs, the social aspects. But of course, we have to think about the interlinkages, because once they got already the basic services, we should think about, or yeah, they need to be continue with improving their productivity, of course, how to improve their environment. And having a clear target, for example, in the clean water, when we are talking about the household, everybody else, I mean, other stakeholders need to have the same languages. In earlier time, some people talks about villages, some people about the length of the pipe, other people talks about the number of people. But then through the SDGs, goals, the targets and indicators, it helps references for all stakeholders, including the businesses, to targets on clean water. This is only one example. But the framework SDGs provide through the goals, targets, and indicators really helps all of us working in the same agenda and measuring with or using the same units of analysis. Other thing, besides the mainstreaming the SDGs into development agenda, we also translate the ESGs in the context of the green economy by developing the Green Economy Index. So this is a tool of measurement actually that provide a tangible, representative, and accurate indicators of success to measure the effectiveness of the green economic, or I would say the green transitions, because we have a component of the S, yeah. We are talking about the life expectancy, year of schooling, of poverty, of course, the unemployment, but then how works in other goals, like in economic pillar, we are talking about the energy, for example, renewable energy, how to ensure that inclusiveness, ensuring no one left behind is also applying in many places in Indonesia. So by having the Green Economy Index, it's really helped us for benchmarking among regions. And actually, we could see the progress from time to time. The tool can be used to assess socio, the S, but again, showing the interlinkages with the economic and environment interactions with the context of the green economy, and identify potential risks and also opportunity for the government to design a better green economic policies. In the context of the finance, we have developed the integrated national financing framework, which mapping the potential sources and also seeking strategically how to mobilize and also combining all the finance strategies to increase the impact. So currently, besides of course the improving public spending to incentivize the private funds mobilizations, we also develop other instruments like establishing a blue finance ecosystem for strengthened resource mobilizations, particularly for the maritime, because we are quite big maritime sectors. Developing green banking, as well as improving the tax, like carbon tax, aligning the philanthropy and faith-based financing. That's including the private entities as well as the faith-based organizations. So at the end, we are talking about sustainable development ecosystem. I think previous speakers mentioning about the green suku. We have this instrument already now completing by also the SDGs bonds. This year, our second SDGs bonds expanding to have not only social focus, but also the green and the blue focus. We also developed the fiqh of zakat for SDGs. And we identify which goals that could actually align with the Islam principles, the fiqh, and that's improved the involvement of many others philanthropies all over the places in Indonesia, because we are talking about 17,000 islands with different kind of practice and also the needs. So that's why the faith-based organizations using the same fiqh, the SDGs fiqh, using from zakat as well as the fiqh on the SDGs, it's really helped to implement basically in relate with the SDGs achievement. So based on the data, many of the faith-based organizations still focusing on the social, but incrementally they are also including the interlinkages of the social focus, which is mainly earlier about on the poor, but later on also covering other goals in the environment, for example, like water, as well as the disaster resilience. Oh, one more thing, we now also trying to youth mapping the Wakaf land and try to working together with the local governments and organizations in the utilizations of the Wakaf land for the SDGs. And again, in many cases, still focusing on the social aspects for schools, Islamic boarding schools, as well as on the productivity of the people. Other examples now including leveraging with the scheme of the blended finance toward beyond the social aspect. So for the micro hydro, for example, not only providing the water for people in remote areas, but of course, when we're talking about the maintenance and others, we need to improve the capacity of the people in the village, how to manage the environment. Of course, this blended finance still remain a small segment of the financing for the SDGs landscape. But in the G20, we promote the blended finance to scale it up, particularly to help and also to work together with other developing countries and least developing countries, including the SIDS, because it's really helpful to fill in the gap many projects of the SDGs, the last mile projects or issues that cannot be achieved with the big investors. When we meet with the big investors on the private sectors, mainly oftentimes they're talking about the scale on the profit size. But in fact, the last mile of the SDGs, particularly when we're talking about this, it's scattered all over places, and it's much more smaller when particularly like in energy, in water, and so on. So blended finance is we sure that if we could provide with a clear guidelines of the blended finance mechanism, we could attract more private finance to also help developing countries as IDS to really achieving all the targets of SDGs on time. I think I should stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Vivi. I have another question for you. Just now you have mentioned about the social issues and also the financial instruments which you are using to address those issues. So my question is how you're going to, are you already collaborating with the private financial sector? Particularly Islamic financial sector so that they can also play their role in order to address these social issues. So do you have any such mechanism in place already, or you're thinking about it?
In smaller cases, yes, it's been a while. The last 3 to 4 years, we work together with the philanthropists, the Indonesian philanthropists, working to tackle many social issues in many places of Indonesia. But again, the scale of the needs is huge, particularly after the COVID. And it's not easy to bring investors, I would say, to help the people to really providing the equitable access as well as the productivities. We need a bigger investment, because we are talking about the green economy. When we are talking about the energy, we cannot back to the brown or even the black source of energy. And the green economy needs a green transitions. We are talking about a new technology which is very expensive for us, the developing countries, the least developed countries. And also we are talking about the green job as well as the green transition, how to prepare many people. We are the fourth populous country in the world, and how to accelerate all of this. We cannot do leapfrogging. We need a moonshotting because it's less than a decade. And how to accelerate, I think it's a time for the global actions to show the leadership, to bring all the sources. It's really to ensure the principles of no one left behind. One here that doesn't mean only people, but also countries or continent.
Thank you, Dr. Vivi, for sharing your experience. Now, if I can bring Sina into discussion, a very important part of sustainability integration is the reporting standards. As we know, we have different reporting standards available in the industry, and which are also being, practiced by different Islamic financial institutions and other commercial financial institutions. So, Ms. Sina, if you can please share your views on the reporting standards and the regulations. And what are the strategies do we have? And are there any challenges that are faced by Islamic financial institutions in particular?
Thank you so much for allowing me to join this perspective panel. And I'd say, yes, I think there's strong progress that happened and started since the announcement by the International IFRS Board and the creation of the International Sustainability Standard Boards that took place in the last COP26. Is a change, a game changer, I think, for companies and financial institutions, including, of course, Islamic banks, because there was concern that existing different frameworks, not only national or regional, but also on an international framework, is a hindrance for interested institutions that require the integration of either ESG, sustainability, or even climate change. And by the idea of starting to integrate these standards into one unified framework, this could ease the process of reporting and encourage further institutions to adopt sustainability governance practices and to start even integrating climate change related reporting if there is a clear unified guidelines. And I think this is very important as a step. Of course, we are still to see that by them announcing these frameworks, what will happen, and possibility of providing sustainable and technical assistance for institutions is as important as well. Number two, also, there is a need to highlight the commonalities or the possibility of not only having one unified international framework for sustainability or ESG, but also that we can highlight the commonalities between international frameworks and base tenets, especially that Sharia, the core values of Sharia is very common and can be put aside, side to side, actually, sustainability practices, and this is very important. Not all banks or Islamic financial institutions really understand, especially beyond the GCC, understand the importance and the commonalities and synchronicity between existing international sustainability ESG frameworks and the commonalities and the common base values and tenets of Islamic Sharia. There's also a potential that we should not miss, and I think it's very important that Islamic finance and Islamic banking institution has, I think, historic opportunity to go beyond investors that are only interested in Islamic finance from a face perspective. Because ESG investors, there's a growing increase in the number of ESG investors across the globe. And by providing access to knowledge and better understanding of the linkage or the linked landscape of Islamic finance and sustainable development and ESG would even give a better accessibility for Islamic financial products to be utilized by non-faith-based or conventional investors historically. This is also another point that is very, very important. However, when we talk about reporting, we also need to understand that Islamic financial institutions need to already have integrated sustainability governance and a very strong framework within their own respective institutions. The inavailability of enough acceleration of regulations in the region, in the MENA region, for example, can be considered a hindrance because many companies and financial banks, Islamic banks, lack the know-how and require the existence of guidance, information, access to knowledge that will enable them to accelerate the process of integrating ESG or sustainability as well. Another also point that is very important, there is a discrepancy between different practices. For example, we have a sustainable financial framework issued by the UAE. We have now in Egypt a new sustainability framework issued by the Egyptian Central Bank. The non-banking sector in Egypt already has or benefits from an existing regulation in ESG and CIBAFI. Although these efforts are commendable and needed, however, there is a need for commonalities, again, harmonization. If we are talking about harmonization on an international level of standards and frameworks, we also need the same on a regional level as well. We're talking about economic environment and globalization that requires transboundary and trans-country transactions, partnerships that require better harmonization and understanding the commonalities of framework. It's also as important. Accessibility to data and the know-how. It's nice and all to talk about efforts and existing need to integrate ESG and TCFD or climate-related disclosure and reporting, but it's also as important to enable or create the enabling environment needed, not only through regulation, but also access to technical support. Because given the current situation or the current state of banking institution, Islamic banking institutions in the region, there is a need for strong awareness, access to information, capacity building for them to be able to assess and properly integrate ESG and even climate-related disclosure. There's a need to understand how to approach methodologies when it comes to climate risk assessment, categorization within the portfolio, How can they align it to different local and national markets and regional and global markets? There is a need to have enough skills within staff that are custodians of the operational agendas and business lines within respective institutions, so they would be able to do so. And there's also need to have a strong access to data, understanding also that the repercussions or the value code missing out on climate-related business opportunity, green opportunities. So I can say in a nutshell that although there is a registered acceleration and progress towards implementing reporting, there is also a stronger need for capacity building, prepping up and upscaling the staff of banks, and even the executive management and overarching directors, board of directors, for them to understand the implications and the importance of integrating or mainstreaming ESG and TCFD as well. Another also point that is very important is that there is lack of understanding the market, and not being able to understand the market is also impacting the level to which green finance or access to green finance can be undertaken by Islamic institutions. And the lack of not understanding taxonomies or guidance for green projects specifically also can be considered a missed opportunity. And all of this can easily be reflected on inability or insufficient reporting, whether ESG, TCFD reporting as well.
Thank you, Ms. Sin. Another question which I have is also linked with this, sustainability reporting. Nowadays, we see that there is a growing debate on this area, and I personally read a few articles on Financial Times, Forbes, and Bloomberg, and I'm talking about related to greenwashing. So in your opinion, how do you see it? Like, how big is this problem for ESG and how to address it?
I think on a global level, yes, with the idea of having a unified framework, I think that will lower or at least provide a limiting boundary for financial institution reporting. I think there is also a need for creating a supervisory framework based on auditing, third-party auditing and assurance, enabling them to provide the required and needed surveillance and supervision for institutions. Because with the lack or the inability or the unavailability of supervisory tools that are being practiced on the ground, there is, of course, always room for greenwash. And of course, this should also be highlighted in the region. If I'm going to discuss the MENA region, the lack of available technical know-how and supervisory tools within the region or by the regulators of the region can also be a gap that can encourage more and more greenwashing, especially that the value-based or institution that really capitalize or report on ESG is not yet sufficient enough and do not have enough technical power to be able to do that without utilizing or succeeding or falling into the gap of greenwashing.
Thank you. That's very interesting. I think we have some good amount of time, so we can have another round of questions, and we will also encourage our audience to send us questions in this Q&A tab below. You can send us questions, and we will definitely convey to our speakers. So if I can ask Mr. Shafi a question. See, just now we were talking about the integration of sustainability and how Islamic financial institutions are doing. They're taking their initiatives to integrate sustainability into their operations and the strategy. So you can share your experience at GFH Financial Group, how you have integrated ESG into your operations, please.
Thanks. GFH Group has been continuously progressing on the ESG as an essential element of its strategic objective and the ongoing objective of being a valuable contributor to the market and the society in terms of promoting what ESG is. First of all, as a framework, if I can begin with, the framework that we have or we established is a triangulate of three elements, which is basically the SDGs of the UN. We have the Bahrain's vision and the visions which almost the region is mutually agreed upon in terms of the 2030 vision, 2060 vision, which of course attributed to carbon dioxide objectives and of course carbon emissions related objectives. The third one is basically, as we are a listed company in 4 different exchanges, Bahrain, Kuwait, Abu Dhabi, and Dubai, it also gives not just a motive or a challenge to have more transparency. And of course, as a listed company, the first thing is as an objective is to gain, of course, the shareholders' engagement and trust. And one of the things that GFH has successfully done is, as part of the issuance of Green Sukuk, of 900 million green sukuk. It was issued and listed in the London Exchange. It is the first ever Bahraini entity to issue a green sukuk, which is a great leap for GFH to take that move. This was under Infracorp, which is the sustainability arm of GFH Group, which has been successfully, being part of many sustainable objectives and missions. One of them is building an infrastructure that is green and promoting, while being in projects that is related, a better environment in terms of usage and renewable energies. The second thing is the way that we see it is not just a corporate objective, Dr. Mohammed. The way that we see it is we implement within the stakeholders, the individuals. Part of the stakeholders, of course, are the staff, the clients, the board members, the shareholders. We're talking about a great population. And the way that we are capitalizing on ESG is not just through, let's say, frameworks, policies. We also have been successfully rolling out campaigns within the company in terms of usage plastics. For example, today every employee has a bottle of water which is reusable. We got out of plastics. We have implemented and encouraged to that. Now, this might be a bit of mainstream to many companies, but the way that we see it is we want staff and stakeholders encourage others through the families, through the friends, and being a role model in terms of ESG, because the way that we see a successful rollout of ESG practices is by role model. And the way I see it is this has been a great evidence in the past years. And the way that you create a role model as an organization and cascades down to individuals within the organization, it gives a lot of, let's say, motive to other people to take the lead as well. And I always, whenever I discuss with anyone, you might be competent to give out the best products or being successful in terms of getting good bottom lines and good profits. But we are always happy whenever we see a lead by example, where organizations follow others and governments give, incentives, provides flexible ways to implement these kind of practices. So GFH has been always maximizing its efforts, to put a lot of energy in implementing ESG practices and promote it, because I think promoting that practices is the key element here. Because you could, write policies, you could put on flyers, you can put commercial ads, you can do whatever, any organization sees. But we believe that the influence by individual takes a lot of contribution to do that. And also, during COVID, I think there has been a great leap also in terms of being part of the society. We have donated about $1 million in terms of promoting and helping and supporting COVID-related causes with national initiatives. So I think COVID also has onboarded many corporations to implement it more, because, the mainstream, or earlier we had the organizations where maybe listed companies felt that they are liable to take ESG actions. But now even family business and small corporations are taking it seriously, not because of their commitment to their shareholders, which are probably less than other listed companies. In fact, they took it because it's part of their performance, sustainability and performance. And it has been proven that, corporations who do not practice ESG in its most best practice, they have higher cost of capital, they have lack of transparency with shareholders, they gradually lose the trust with shareholders and the community. And I think one important aspect which Dr. Vivi mentioned, that the collaboration between, society is important, because, you have the organization which are mostly profitable and they're in the business, and they have sort of power of influence to either the clients, the people, and the media, and the small societies where they provide and they have volunteer aspect of it. If that kind of collaboration, which seems to be easy when I talk about it, it is quite difficult to merge those two into one, because the funding comes from the corporate side and the real work, and let's say the expertise comes from the societies down on the streets. They know the problems within the people, the families. So in general, the influence, I think, is the most important factor when it comes to corporates and individuals. It's surprisingly, contagious how influence is done. And, being here in GFH, if you could see the enthusiasm of people wanting to promote that kind of green-friendly environment within the bank, it gives you, everyone has its in humanity. And as you know, every person as a human has this kind of instinct that they want to make things better. And whenever you feel that you're doing something better, it gives you a lot of pride. So if we don't capitalize on this kind of pride and humanity and put it in a more corporate level and share awareness through many stakeholder levels, I think we will be able to understand how we could cover many aspects of ESG issues and problems. And this is what we aspire, especially that we are now, looking into year end, and we look at not just, the profits, the financial performance, which is of course an important factor, but we want to know how the brand of the company is being associated with ESG. And this is the most important factor because, with evidence, most of the companies, if I say all of it, most of it, I'd say, those who do not practice ESG best practices, I'd say, you would notice that the curve goes down in acceleration. You would surprisingly see it go down. And there's no immediate, I'd say, factor into that. But once you lose that kind of connection between being attached to society, the environment, the climate, it goes down by default. You don't even have to, explain it. It goes down with years. And I believe whenever we capitalize on the individuals surrounding us and putting some guidelines and codes into having, let's say, mandatory activities to ensure a better climate, a better even practices outside of corporate arena, the result is significant. And we saw that on a very smaller scale. I can always imagine it if it's done on a higher scale, where dedicated, I'd say, committees or individuals within companies and practicing and contributing and praising these kind of practices, you would be surprised how much it would give to the community and the corporate level as well.
Thank you, Mr. Shafi, for sharing your experience at GFH. Dr. Dalal, if I can ask you, we know that when integrating sustainability, there are challenges. So if you can please give us your view on the key challenges that are faced by Islamic financial institutions when they integrate sustainability, and how CIBAFI Sustainability Guide is helping them to address those challenges. Please.
Yes, sure. Actually, as banks will be, as we mentioned, I think even in the previous presentations, that there will be more and more pressure on banks and call for banks to support this mobilization for sustainability integration. So I can think about broadly 5 key challenges that banks are currently facing, which also represent opportunities, for innovation and for revisiting actually how they conduct financial intermediation. So the number one is the alignment with the national mobilization agendas in the countries where they operate. So as we mentioned, the first step for a bank to decide on integrating basically sustainability is to see what would be the key focus areas that the management can focus on. And that means that it is important to identify a list of sustainability focus areas which are aligned with the national development strategies, with the, for example, would be in the Sustainable Development Agenda or the climate mitigation and adaptation action areas to actually under the Paris Agreement, for example. So because this step cannot be done and disconnected actually from all of these strategies, since we want to have impact actually on addressing those sustainable development challenges, being it environmental or social objectives. So that is very important to dedicate the necessary time and resources to properly design or address this phase. And then the second challenge would be on how to integrate, once these focus areas have been identified, how to integrate them in the bank's operations and how that can be translated into the operational aspects and the organization's operations. So in this, there are cases where banks, for example, may lack the necessary expertise, for example, understanding what are the key ESG indicators, for example, that can be used, the knowledge about the necessary strategies that are relevant for the bank. Can this expertise be developed in-house or can be outsourced? And in this case, we have seen how, for example, certain technology can play a key critical role in this area. As you know, to integrate sustainability, one of the very powerful assets that an institution can own today is access to data, and particularly ESG data. So we've seen some institutions developing dedicated internal teams and departments with that expertise to collect and analyze that ESG data. However, for smaller institutions, it's very difficult to do that. And then that's why we have seen some collaborating with for example, fintechs that focus on providing that ESG data and the necessary tools to analyze it. And there is, of course, one important aspect, which is how to understand and interpret materiality, how which ESG risks, for example, are relevant to Islamic banks. And for example, in which particular sectors and the overall operating context of the bank itself. And that materiality assessment will show, for example, which challenges and issues, for example, are the most important to the bank, but also to its stakeholders. So as I mentioned, that would require a proper environmental and risk management framework to support, that analysis, and also to identify the sources of information that the bank can rely on. And to give you an example, in the guide also there is clear indication about some of these activities, being it, for example, investment and financing activities, or let's say when we talk about credit analysis, that traditionally, for example, when banks conduct their credit analysis, they focus on two broad categories, which include quantitative indicators and qualitative indicators, for example, that look at leverage, liquidity, operational efficiency, earnings quality, performance, behavior, etc. Now, in addition to these two categories, we're adding a third category, which integrates ESG factors into the analysis. And that means that in that credit analysis process, there would be a need for more ESG data, ESG research and scores that looks into, for example, the performance of the client on some aspects of environmental and social objectives. And for that, either the bank would have, of course, to decide on these ESG metrics that would be used, but also on how to assess them using ESG data. And some, of course, as we mentioned, either the option is to rely on third-party ESG scores or to develop their own internal analysis to determine the ESG scores per client. And similar assessment can be done for a variety of activities like finance and investment activities, product development, and of course, any other investment, or even when talking about the capital structure of banks, that now we're talking about debt financing using sustainability-linked instruments. So what activities or additional steps the banks needs to add in, for example, a sustainability-linked issuance as compared to a traditional sukuk issuance. So that means that that integration phase would come up with various, or would require the adjustment of the bank's processes to achieve all of these objectives. And the third challenge would be how to better report on sustainability. Now, if we look at the landscape of reporting in general, we have banks that still report only on CSR. And on the other hand, we have banks that have dedicated sustainability reporting. And some banks that do have pretty much aspects of both in their annual report, but without a dedicated reporting that captures really their sustainability initiatives. And you know that the trend moving forward is to have what we call integrated reporting that has both financial information and ESG or sustainability information in one report. So broadly speaking, if we look at the existing definitions or frameworks available globally, we have various taxonomies, various definitions and frameworks. And how can we harmonize all of this? And how can we have at least a framework that guides banks into reporting on how to report on sustainability and what are the key, perhaps, metrics that they should prioritize and focus on for better transparency? And then fourth area would be to support actually the second challenge about integration is how can banks foster innovation for sustainability? So that means there's a specific skill set that is required to understand how ESG factors or how sustainability considerations can be integrated in social and environmental assessment, being it for project finance or also when developing instruments and products for customers and investors. And we spoke about sustainability-linked instruments in the debt capital market, but also we need more sustainability-linked instruments talking specifically about the banking segment, or that, for example, when for mortgage financing or for car financing, for more products that address social objectives, like, for example, student loans, products targeting women entrepreneurs, farmers, etc. And that is to address the problems that we witnessed during the pandemic, which is basically addressing inclusiveness and financial inclusion. And then finally, one very important area, which is awareness, because now we have a lot of discussions about ESG, but everyone understand what do we mean by sustainability and ESG. So that means that banks would also have a critical role in educating their stakeholders and also their internal teams about how to understand sustainability, what are ESG factors, how to decide on their materiality, and how to integrate them and report them in the bank's business activities. So what role the guide plays in this regard is that it does provide an implementation framework and measurement that supports the banks in integrating but also reporting on sustainability. And as I mentioned, it is catered for various categories of institutions, because as I mentioned, there are institutions that have some form of ESG integration or sustainability integration, and there are institutions that are quite advanced as compared to others, and there are others that are just starting this journey to contribute again to mitigating these global challenges, and these are perhaps the ones that need better support or higher support, if I would say, in terms of integrating sustainability. So the framework provided caters for the needs of these three categories. So it does provide a sustainability implementation framework for the internal assessment of sustainability focus areas, for the alignment with the bank's vision, mission, and the strategy, for the operational integration, for the corporate and Sharia, which includes corporate and Sharia governance, sustainability integration, and then environmental and social risk management. And finally, for the two other challenges, which is the awareness aspect, being it internal and external education, and finally for the monitoring and reporting.
Thank you, Dr. Dalal. We're also receiving a couple of questions. The first question, I think perhaps it has just now, Dr. Dalal, she has addressed that question on the practically implementing ESG strategy operationally in the Islamic Bank. So I have another question from one of the participants. It says how to address shareholders' concern about the cost implications on ESG implementations. Perhaps Mr. Shafi, if you can answer this question. The question is how to address shareholders' concerns about the cost implication on ESG implementation. A bank or financial institutions is going to implement ESG. So what will be the cost implication and how to address shareholders' concern for that?
Yeah, to be honest, the way I see it is more of an investment rather than it's a cost, if I see it. And the return of this investment is, divided into many aspects. And one of the things that, of course, as a shareholder would seek is maximizing the profits and ensuring the organization is in its best performance with healthy balance sheet and all that. So when ESG practices, or let's say we invest or pump in money to ESG, it is actually a very long strategy to maintain the organization to be in the next 10, 20, and 30 years. So when we add the term sustainable performance, sustainable environment, and we associate the sustainability with the organization and its stakeholders, I think it would give a lot of, let's say, comfort to a shareholder that would see that this is not, it's more of an investment that has a great return in the coming years rather than a cost. And one important aspect of this, doctor, and who wanted to know about this, is the return on this is not just when it comes to the company. When we invest in ESG best practices, frameworks, when we build a better society, when we invest in infrastructure, when we have renewable energy, we associate that with the generations coming. So again, when we have this emotional aspect, that this is not just a performance driven to the organization, it is in fact the generations of our children's and children's, that they will live in a better standard of living, that would be more convincing to anyone who see that. So in conclusion, it's an investment. We see it as an investment, a long-term investment rather than a cost, because a cost is usually paid and you expect a quick return just to capitalize on that cost. But this is definitely a long-term investment.
Thank you, Mr. Shafi. I have another question for Mr. Bashar. That is, in your view, if I ask you that, what are the prospects of ESG-linked investment in Islamic finance industry? How do you see it? Are we moving in the right direction, or we should take another direction?
Okay, I mean, that's a broad question. So if maybe we need to look at it from quickly on 3 dimensions: the history, where we stand now, and what we expect in the future. So history, I mean, in the past few years, 4 or 5 years, whether you're looking at sukuk issuance, whether you're looking at government agendas, whether you're looking at even some very few bank financing, bank strategies, it's all moving in an upward trajectory. So even during the pandemic, actually, in some cases, you could say or argue that it accelerated some of these initiatives. So sukuk, for example, it represents around 10% of our global rated portfolio. The ESG, 10% of our rated global sukuk portfolio is actually in an ESG format, which is a substantial part. And specifically, we rate around 80% of the global ESG hard currency. So that's one. Many banks, CEOs, and governing bodies are starting to take a stronger stand on where they want things to move. Specifically, financial institutions want, because they came to the realization, okay, we have a unique offering, we've done that, and let's see how we can take this forward. So it's moving from that. Governments, again, and government strategies is also doing the same thing, and they're having targets. And these targets require funding, these targets require actual work on the ground to be delivered. That is also an additional thing that we're seeing currently. The last aspect, and I think all my fellow panelists alluded to that, is actually awareness. And I think that's a key issue. Awareness is something that is lacking on multi-levels. It's lacking on the institutional level, it's lacking on the level, it's sometimes, to be very honest, even on the regulation level. And that's a key driver, because if you're not aware of it, whether, to be very honest, that's another driver in some countries for Islamic finance. Yes, it's not in the GCC because it's a substantial part of the financing industry, but awareness of Islamic finance, its unique offering, let alone ESG, is not even available there. That is because it's low on the priority of people. Many of the Islamic countries, they have low bankability. So they're not really worried about, okay, Islamic finance, although that's definitely a filter and one of the limitations, but many of them is not even finding, they cannot open a bank account, let alone say, okay, I need it to be in Sharia. And if you add to that, I need to consider ESG related, I think that challenge becomes more difficult, because in the priority of many countries of OIC, that element comes as a low priority. And I'm here talking about the wider public. And I think until that changes, you will still have, I would say, obstacles in that. Now, after building awareness, which is, I have to say, a difficult process, which by itself can take a panel to discuss, you need to have track record. Because at the end of the day, people will assess you, whether you're local people, regional people, or international, on track record. And based on your track record, that will build a very critical element, confidence. And without confidence, then you will not have the right investors, you will not have the right issuers, you will not have the right stakeholders. So I would say it is moving in the right directions, but there is a lot of limitations, whether on the commonalities between Islamic finance and ESG, or Islamic finance on itself, let alone that standardization, complexities, understanding, awareness. So I would say the road is not easy. It is moving in the right direction. An acceleration would need a stronger top-down push. And this is something that we started to see recently. How strong is that, and how quick is this going to translate in the ground is an interesting space to watch.
Thank you, Mr. Bashir. And in agreement with you, yes, definitely awareness is a very important factor, which all Islamic financial institutions, they should consider it and also focus on this. In fact, another question which we have from the audience, it is also related to the same area. Someone has asked, how can financial professionals motivate their institutions to integrate ESG? So this is coming from the employee side, financial profession, how they can contribute and they can convince their financial institutions to integrate ESG. So anyone from the panelists, you can answer the question. Ms. Sina, would you like to?
Yes,
please?
Sure. I think having internally strong or champions, staff champions is very, very important. But the challenge is huge as well, because they need to demonstrate to their executive management and to the board examples, strong examples from the market as well, and provide numbers and financials. And it's not easy, again, as I've said before, access to information, especially beyond the GCC in more developed economies in the Middle East, is not being able to find sustainability champions, case studies, for example, when it comes to issuance of green sukuk, green facilities, the availability of sustainability-linked loans. the absence of these examples does not provide the staff with enabling data and cases that they can provide to their executives. However, I think by having stronger regulations on board, when having a government that will be able to provide this enabling environment, provide case studies, provide information and guidance, this can be overcome. Stronger harmonization and knowledge sharing platforms such as CIBAFI and other platforms can also provide staffers and bankers the opportunity and possibility to exchange information with other success stories beyond borders of countries, and this can also provide them with enough information.
Thank you, Ms. Sina. We have another question from the audience. In the OIC countries, supervisors means the the central banks and the financial authorities, are they developing strategies to enhance the adoption of ESG criteria in commercial banks and also open access databases on green Islamic finance?
Thank you, Dr. Muhammad. Yeah, so what we have seen is that, of course, we noticed the mobilization among various stakeholders. I think one of the key developments we have seen is the development, for example, for green bond frameworks or broader sustainable bonds and sukuk frameworks in the region. So few governments have actually that either at the government level or also at the institution level. They're also more focused, as we mentioned, there's a lot of innovation in the debt capital markets, and that actually the purpose is to scale up the contribution of debt capital market in mitigating this funding gap to achieve sustainable development. In terms of databases, what we have seen is that now there are more and more data providers that support, banks in integrating ESG assessments in their strategy. For example, when it comes to credit analysis or investment decisions, etc. And I alluded to this point earlier in my talk, is that now there will be more need for more ESG data to support in decision making. So we've seen a few providers, either some of them are actually fintechs that support banks in integrating ESG and providing ESG data, but also in ESG reporting, but also among rating agencies and international data providers that now have dedicated databases for ESG. So these are, of course, subscription-based, and that facilitates, as I mentioned earlier, there are two approaches. Either you develop that capacity in-house to develop your own ESG scores to assess your customers and then investors, etc., or you can outsource that and rely on other providers externally. From the government side, we see a trend, because now if you look at Europe, these ESG, now we have dedicated ESG regulations. If you look at the European Green Deal or even the taxonomies that the EU has issued recently, and we foresee similar trend in the coming months or years here in the region because of the urgency of the matter. As I mentioned, a lot of guidelines are still voluntary if we talk specifically about the region, but in order to scale up actually the contribution of the financial sector to sustainability, we do need to move to the next stage, which is dedicated sustainability and ESG regulations. So a few initiatives are in the pipeline, and hopefully these will materialize with more dedicated regulations and better impact.
Dr. Just a small question, like if you can quickly give an answer to that. When we talk about this S factor or component of ESG, so how Islamic banks, they can integrate into their products and services and in operations?
Yes, that's a very good question. And actually it's related to two previous questions, that we still have this misunderstanding that ESG negatively impacts performance. And that has been actually rejected in the academic research, for example, showing that integrating ESG objective actually doesn't impact financial performance, and it has been tested in the investment fund sector, and similar analysis can be extended to other segments. However, how do we do it? Because a lot of people, when thinking about S, they still think about charity. That's completely wrong. So you can perfectly integrate the S while having competitive and financially and ensure financial performance. So competitive and profitable products that also supports, financial performance. And we have seen good examples in the debt capital markets where actually social objectives have been integrated through SRI Sukuk. I think a good example is the Khazana Sukuk that focus, for example, on education, and they have implemented a KPI mechanism whereby the actually obligor is incentivized to perform or to achieve the KPIs of the project, because that would result in actually reducing the profit payments to the sukuk holders. And we have seen there are many other examples in conventional markets that we can leverage on in the Islamic financial industry in the area of impact investing. So projects targeting health, education, renewable energy. Renewable energy, even though it's green, but it has all those social applications, because there have been studies, for example, demonstrating that mitigating energy poverty through, for example, clean energy can also have impact on health, because a lot of the fossil fuel based energy sources can be damaging and can have a negative impact on health. And also that in rural areas, energy poverty also impacts education. So you can actually link a lot of environmental objectives to social impact. So the point is that, and that's why I mentioned earlier, innovation, that we can perfectly structure new products that meet the economic, social, and environmental objectives while being competitive and meeting actually mitigating the global challenges. I think that's the mindset we need to change in the industries if we want to better integrate the S in the activities of Islamic banks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Dalal, and also all other speakers for sharing their experiences and views. Ladies and gentlemen, we have now come to the end of our webinar. We would like to thank all the speakers that have joined us today for sharing their valuable insights and for the fruitful discussions that cover various aspects of today's topic. I would like to thank the audience and participants for their attention and for the active participation. Please do visit the CIBAFI website and follow us on social media accounts to be updated on CIBAFI activities and initiatives. We thank you again, and we look forward to seeing you in our future events. Thank you and have a very good day ahead.